Why do we believe in the unbelievable? So, this is going to be interesting, isn't it? A little bit spooky, a little bit macabre, a little bit supernatural. I'm going to be addressing a question which has fascinated me all of my adult life, and indeed possibly even earlier, and that is, why do people believe in the unbelievable? And I'm sure it's a question you must have asked yourself when you've seen rituals or seen practices which seem strange, or you've heard about beliefs which, if they were true, would be fantastic, incredible. And we ask, why do people believe in the unbelievable? And the unbelievable I want to talk about tonight is superstition. And this is a belief in supernatural causes. And that's any explanation that appeals to the notion of forces or energies or mechanisms or ghosts or spirits or deities or gods. Because if these things were real and these forces were real, they defy the natural laws of the world as we currently understand them, hence they're supernatural. And moreover, there's no reliable evidence for them. So they're beliefs, and they're very common. Now, the most common form is in the context of religions. All religion have supernatural beliefs. And of course, the majority of people in the world have some form of religious belief. But I would argue that even non-believers, atheists, they also entertain supernatural beliefs, even though they may not be aware of it. Because many of these beliefs can operate under the radar of conscious awareness. They're what we call in psychology implicit. And I think that's because they emerge early in development as children as a way of trying to make sense of the world. Now, you can take a child and you can educate them with a scientific perspective. But I don't think these beliefs ever entirely go away. So there's a science of belief. And I was invited to Austin to take part in a workshop today. And many of my colleagues are in the audience. So I can't possibly do justice to the diversity of all the interests in this field. But I think it's fair to say that we agree that the origins of belief must be something due to the way we evolved and the brains that we evolved. We're a particularly social animal. And what makes us very special in the animal kingdom is our capacity for communication, to share knowledge and pass it on from each generation to the next. And then build on that knowledge to increase our understanding of the world around us. We're also an animal equipped with a brain which tries to make sense of the world by forming stories to make predictions. And sometimes those accounts or explanations generate what we now recognize as supernatural explanations. So, I'm going to be talking on these topics tonight. Why do we believe what people tell us? And why do we believe what we tend to think is possible, even though it be supernatural? But before I do this, I'm going to show a demonstration to test your understanding of the supernatural. Tell me what you think's going on here. They say seeing is believing. Put your hands up if you think that Kevin James's demonstration was some form of trick. Okay, well that's reassuring. Okay. Now put your hands up if you know how he did it. Isn't that interesting? You can go above the evidence of your own eyes to come to the right conclusion to infer it must be some sort of illusion. Now, what's interesting is, if I was to show that video to babies as young as 10 months old, they would also be surprised. They would look longer. And that tells us that babies are recognizing something isn't quite right there. They're operating with what we call an intuitive theory. It's intuitive because 10-month-old babies, we don't tell them what to think about the human body. And it's a theory because it allows them to make predictions about what is possible and what is impossible. And it turns out that babies have brains which are trying to interpret the world all the time and make sense of what they see. And one of the things they pay a lot of attention to are human bodies, and it allows them to make predictions. So equipped with this brain to generate intuitive theories, we embark on trying to understand the world around us. But sometimes we come up with explanations which really fall into the realms of supernatural thinking. And I'll be coming back to that throughout the talk, the idea that we sometimes generate understandings which actually are not possible. But just return to the example of Kevin James. Now, what I find remarkable is that you can go beyond the evidence of your own eyes, but there are some people who hold beliefs which are equally as bizarre and fantastical as just what you've seen, in the absence of any evidence whatsoever. So if you phone up adults around the country and you ask them, do you believe in this sort of thing? This is the sort of percentages that the numbers of people who believe, from things like witchcraft, telepathy, ghosts, in the absence of any evidence. Often it's they've heard about it, or they know somebody who's experienced it. In fact, 3 out of 4 adults have at least one of these beliefs, and of course, that's even higher if you consider something like religion. But what about countries which don't have religions? What about secular countries like Scandinavia? Well, it's true, they don't have the same amount of religious beliefs, but they also believe other things about spirituality or other things which we call the paranormal. And even those of us who regard ourselves as very rational, scientific, don't believe anything without the evidence, we also entertain beliefs which are supernatural. I'm going to give you a good example of that. Put your hands up if you've ever had that experience that you think you're being watched from behind. Yeah? Just about everyone, I imagine. And put your hands up if you think you can tell you're being watched from behind. Yeah. Most of us think we can do that. When that question was asked 100 years ago at Harvard University, 9 out of 10 students thought they could tell they were being watched from behind. I asked the very same question of Bristol students only a couple of years back. And again, about 9 out of 10 think they've got an ability to detect when they're being watched. But if that were true, that would violate the natural laws of how vision works or how the brain works. And I like that example because it's clearly not a religious belief, and it's not even one that societies tell us what to think. Rather, it just emerges spontaneously. It's what I call a secular supernatural notion. Now, normally these sorts of beliefs are fairly benign, but sometimes belief in supernatural powers can actually affect our wealth and our health. Consider the number 13, which is considered very unlucky in the West. Now, when Brussels Airlines discovered they had inadvertently painted 13 dots on the tail fin of their planes, they had to ground the whole fleet to paint on another extra dot to bring the number up to 14, at great expense. It's been estimated that Friday the 13th costs the US economy somewhere in the region of between $800 and $900 million because people won't trade or they'll take the day off work. And of course, it's not the number 13 in the Far East, it's the number 4. And the reason the number 4 is considered unlucky in the Far East is because it sounds like the word for death, both in Cantonese and Japanese. Now that turns out to be something which can affect your health. For example, a paper published in the British Medical Journal showed that on the 4th day of each month, there was a significant spike in the number of people who died from heart attacks in those of them who had an Asian background, compared to the non-Asian residents. So literally, they were being scared to death. They obviously must have had some underlying heart condition, and then they got frightened, and this triggered within a fatal cardiac arrest. And it's not just believers who have, it's not just the superstitious. This is my own department, the University of Bristol, Department of Experimental Psychology. Now, when we built a new entrance, which would have corresponded to 13 Priory Road, the authority said, no, you can't have number 13 because there was a house there that was hit by a stray bomb during World War II. So I find it rather ironic that I'm in the Faculty of Science at 12A Priory Road and not 13. Now, these beliefs have been with us for thousands of years. Indeed, right in the very beginnings of civilization, you see the evidence of belief. And if you go into the prehistory, there's lots of evidence and artifacts which show that people had beliefs in the fantastical, the supernatural. These are just 3 examples. Cave paintings, 13,000 years ago. We have this creature which is part animal, part human. I like this one. This is a mammoth tusk. And this was shattered into hundreds of pieces. And when they reassembled it again, they discovered it was a part man, part lion. And throughout this period, there are these objects which must have played an important role in some form of ritual. And it looks like it was some sort of, because this is a female figure, obviously, it was some sort of fertility rite. And this makes a lot of sense, because in the prehistory, they wouldn't have known what controlled the animals, or what controlled the success of a hunt, or what controlled fertility. So they would have tried to engage in something to try and appease what they thought were the gods. And this notion of engaging in rituals to try and control important events is something we still do today. If you think about it, all the important events from births and health and marriages and all the things which are really important in our lives, they're associated with rituals, aren't they? And this is a legacy and an attempt to try and control things. But of course, that all changed about 400 years ago. Because 400 years ago, in the West at least, we had what was called the scientific revolution. And this is a depiction of this event, this transition from the dark ages of witchcraft into the period of enlightenment. This is a picture called Experiment with an Air Pump by Joseph Wright. And he uses light and dark to show this transition into this period of understanding. Now, this is what's interesting about this picture is he uses this is a scientist here, and here we've got a bird. And the bird is supposed to stand for spirituality. And here he's sort of saying, well, spirituality is being killed off by the evil scientist. And all the children are distraught, of course. Now, what's going on is he's put a bird inside a vacuum pump. And indeed, this was an experiment done by Robert Boyle. So there's a slight irony here, because Robert Boyle was one of the founding fathers of the scientific revolution. And he, like all his colleagues, was devoutly religious. You see, they rejected the witchcraft, but they believed that the world was a complex machine that through the scientific method they could uncover God's great plan. It was a machine ultimately built by God. So science has been very powerful and very useful. It's provided all the technologies which have made our lives so much longer, so much more comfortable. But when science turns its attention to claims of the supernatural powers, it's made a pronouncement, and it said, there's no evidence for it. It's illogical. It's irrational. And yet we're happy to take the technologies that science provides us, but when scientists tell us our beliefs are not real, we don't trust them. We don't accept that. So why is it the case that the general public don't accept what science has to say about our beliefs? Why is it that we trust scientists? Well, it's down to this individual. There he is. Dr. Evil. Now, some of you won't know who Dr. Evil is. You may be a bit young for this. But he's this kind of evil scientist. He's a megalomaniac. It's a caricature by Mike Myers, but like all caricatures, it's based on a perceived truth, that scientists are maybe up to no good. One of the reasons this happens, I think, is because we accept the technologies, but we're frightened that maybe all the things which are threatening our future are because science is tinkering with nature. Another reason we don't trust scientists is that we don't understand the process of science. You see, science doesn't deal with certainties in the way that we think it does. You cannot prove that a ghost doesn't exist. It's just a logical impossibility. Rather, what scientists do is they accumulate evidence, and they look at the evidence, and then they make a judgment about whether the evidence supports a position or not. So they talk in the language of mathematics and statistics and probabilities. But most of us who are not scientists don't understand probability. We don't understand the notion of likelihoods. Rather, we treat our examples as being either right or wrong based on our own experience. So I'll give you a concrete example. Imagine that you have a dream about your great-aunt Bessie, and you haven't seen or heard of great-aunt Bessie for many years. And the next morning, you get a phone call to tell you that, unfortunately, great-aunt Bessie passed away. Now, no amount of explanation in terms of the number of people who are dreaming of lost relatives and then finding out nothing has happened another day is going to make that experience any less significant to you. You see, our lives are punctuated with strange and weird experiences. They're called coincidences. And we only pay attention to those things which seem to be so unlikely, so unnatural, rather than actually recognizing that there are many of these coincidences happening all the time. So science, we tend to reject what science says. So why do we think like this? Well, there's differing opinions. If you're someone like Richard Dawkins, then you point the finger squarely and firmly at religion and say we're indoctrinating children to believe the supernatural. And he is right to some extent. No child is born to be Christian, no child is born to be Jewish or born to be Islamic. Rather, they adopt the religious belief systems in the environment in which they grow up. But where I think he may have overstated the case is that we tend to believe certain types of things, and many religions share certain sorts of beliefs. Rather, I think that religions capitalize on our tendency to believe certain things. So I wrote a book to counter that called The Supersense. And rather than focusing on religion, I wanted to focus on secular beliefs, things which have nothing to do with religion. Again, for example, the sense of being stared at. So I argue that we've got a brain that has evolved to make sense of the world, and sometimes we come up with explanations which, if they were true, would be supernatural. Now, don't worry, it's just a picture. I think another good thought experiment, we use this term a thought experiment, if you think through the logic of it, I think there's another good reason to cast some shred of doubt about the indoctrination notion entirely. If you were to do that impossible experiment of taking children and placing them on an island and raising them in the absence of any society, much in the way that this was in the story of Lord of the Flies by William Golding, he talked about these children who were abandoned or marooned on a desert island. And the story talks about their descent into savagery, but in addition, they started to create their own demons, their own monsters, the beast that was in the forest. So I think that we, in the absence of being told what to think, would spontaneously generate our own understanding and our own predictions about the world. And that would also include the possibility of creatures and beasts and monsters. So we have a brain, I think, which creates these intuitive theories. We are incredibly susceptible to being to testimony as well. I'm not denying that we also believe what we are told, but I think it works in combination together to create this tendency to believe in the supernatural. So here are some of the things that are the basic points about this super sense. It's a sense that there's a supernatural structure. We have brains which are seeking patterns all the time. In fact, you can't even conceive of randomness. It's not something that we do spontaneously. Also, we see as everything is being caused in the world. We don't see events as being spontaneous. Rather, we always infer that maybe somebody is responsible. There's like some hidden agent. And we prefer a world which is predictable. We don't like uncontrollable, unpredictable worlds. Now, this is particularly important when things are risky. This is a point that one of the pioneers of the field, Malinowski, an anthropologist, pointed out. Because he studied these Trobriand islanders. And he noted that when they went to fish in the open ocean, which was very dangerous, they would always have to have some superstitious ritual to protect them. But they didn't bother when they were fishing in the comparative safety of the inland lagoon. So that's why superstitions excuse me, are associated with those jobs which are particularly dangerous. So firemen and soldiers and fishermen are superstitious. It's an attempt to try and control the uncontrollable nature of the world. As I said, we generate these intuitive theories, and sometimes we come up with misconceptions, and I'll be giving you some examples of these. And I believe that many adult beliefs are based on these initial misunderstandings of the world. We're also a very social animal, so when we think something is possible, we tend to spread that belief. And it's actually in our nature to agree with what we're told. We find it very difficult to ignore or to reject other people's beliefs. And finally, I think a belief in the supernatural possibility enables things I call sacred values. Every society needs sacred values. These can be books, they can be locations, they can be objects, they can be rituals. They're sacred because they transcend the boring, mundane world and have divine possibilities. They're potent, they're magical, they're powerful. They can't be copied or reduced, they're immutable. These are things which are, by their nature, unique and special. So, I'm going to give you 3 examples of naturally occurring misconceptions which I think form the basis of later adult supernatural beliefs. Mind-body dualism, I'll explain, sympathetic magic, and essentialism. So mind-body dualism is the belief that our mind is separate to our body. What could be less controversial than that? Most of us experience this. It's a daily experience of our consciousness that we see our mind being separate to our body. We look in the mirror and we can see our faces aging, our bodies aging, but our minds seem to be different to that. My colleague Paul Bloom says we feel different to our bodies, we occupy them, we possess them, we own them. We're like some sort of puppet master controlling a very complex machine, as illustrated in this slide from Men in Black, where you have the alien Rosenberg controlling the android. So this is how we feel the world is. We feel our mind is not part of our body. But the truth of the matter is that the mind must be part of the body. Indeed, it's a product of the brain. That's what the neuroscience tells us. Because if you alter the workings of the brain through damage, disease, or drugs, the mind is also affected accordingly. It's a system which is connected vastly with lots of different areas. But if it is a very complex machine, then in principle you should be able to build an artificial brain. And if you can build an artificial brain, you should be able to build artificial intelligence and indeed an artificial mind. This idea that we're basically complicated meat machines is something which has been examined by scientists and neuroscientists and indeed philosophers. But the one I like the best is Derek Parfit, who's a philosopher at Oxford. And he talks about the idea of the brain producing the mind in the context of another thought experiment. Some of you will be old enough to remember the original Star Trek series. Okay, so let's have a little bit of... This is a and of course the new series also has these. This is the teletransporter system. So Parfit says, imagine what happens. How does a teletransporter system work? Well, he tells us to imagine a machine which can read the physical nature of each body, all the cells and all the particles, and then it can read it like a very complex blueprint, and then reorder matter on a distant planet. And that will create an identical copy of the person. At the same time, back on Earth, the original is being disintegrated instantaneously. Now, people's intuitions are, if that happens, the person is teletransported to the distant planet. But then Parfit says, well, what happens if the machine malfunctions, and rather than copying and destroying the original, it fails to destroy the original, and you've now got 2 identical beings, 2 identical bodies? Well, in that situation, most people think that the original mind is still in the original body, and that the other is somehow mindless. So we decided to look at this. This is this mind-body dualism, that mind looks different to the body. And we basically made a version of Parfit's experiment with a copying machine. Now in it, we told them there was this experiment, and one day she was in the lab and she was cleaning it, and we told them about the fact she had certain things in her mind, certain beliefs, certain attitudes, certain things that she knew to be true. But she also had physical things as well, something written on her arm, she had something in her stomach, she had an organ, all these sorts of things were physical. Then one day, unfortunately, she activates the machine. The machine turns on. And now 2 of them. And they're identical. So, we then asked the children, and these are children, these are 5 to 6-year-olds, all the way up into adults. We say, what about the second person? What do they have? It's the same as the original. And children and adults are very happy to agree that they have all the same physical properties. But when it comes down to the mind, they don't think that can be copied. So they're mind-body dualists. Now, what has this got to do with supernatural thinking, you might be asking? Well, if the mind is separate to the body, it can't be copied. The physical body can be copied. But if the mind is separate, then maybe it's not tethered to the body. Maybe it can do things that physical bodies can't do. Maybe it can move independently or merge. Maybe it can astral plane, or maybe it can survive the body when the body is gone. So you can see how mind-body dualism, which emerges spontaneously in children, they're not taught this, this could be a basis for later adult supernatural beliefs, which talk about minds and souls and things being separate. Okay, sympathetic magic. Well, this is a belief that if things resemble each other, they're connected by some unseen hidden power and force. And that if you want to affect one object, you simply need to make something which looks like it in order to affect the cause. Now, this is a very old idea. And it was originally thought that if there are things out there in the world which resemble each other, it's because God made them like that. This is known as the doctrine of signatures. And that's what actually the early alchemists were trying to do. They were trying to understand the complexity of God's plan by looking for all the correspondences and then using the patterns which looked alike to try and figure out what he was up to. It became the basis for early herbal remedies. They would use plants which resembled body parts in order to effect some cure. So if you had a problem, if you had a headache, for example, you might eat walnuts because walnuts look like brains. And of course, it is also part of a very popular belief system, still popular today, homeopathy. The idea that like cures like. And of course, you can actually cause harm through the process of sympathetic magic. If you want to harm somebody, you simply have to make an effigy of them, and then you stick pins in it, and they are also then harmed by this sympathetic magic rule. Now, where does this come from? Well, in psychology, in developmental research with children, we know that they have a problem. They have some difficulty sometimes understanding the distinction between how things appear and reality. So, for example, in our studies, we've shown that if you take photographs of an object, young children, 3-year-olds, will misunderstand the relationship of the photograph to the object. If you wet the photograph, for example, they tend to think that the object in the other room has also been dampened. So what about adults? Adults would never make that mistake, would they? Yet, we've been able to show that adults are not certain between the relationship of a photograph to an object. And the way that we've done that is by getting adults sort of to destroy photographs of pictures of loved ones and then measure what their brain is doing. So we demonstrated this recently in a BBC documentary. I'm just going to show you a short clip of it. This is Jin Lucy. She's Chinese. She is a deeply, she rejects the superstition. She regards herself as incredibly rational. But I'll show you the video because I think it explains what's going on.
This is what we call your electrodermal activity. Basically what it measures is how anxious you're feeling.
Is this in real time?
This is real time. So if you start to get just sort of a little bit sweaty or a bit anxious, you'll see a big spike in this. So I have 4 envelopes here, and I'm just going to give you a few instructions about each of them. Take a look at what's inside there.
Not a spider, is it?
No spiders, no.
Okay, so to here, dot, cut.
So the instructions you're getting are to cut from here to here.
Okay, right. Is that it? No, isn't it? No, I'm still quite chilled.
Yeah, you're still quite chilled, but you're cutting a blank piece of paper, so how about doing that with the next envelope down there? Okay? Shall we move on to the next envelope?
Yeah. Oh no, that's gonna make me cry. That's a picture of my dad.
But you're a very rational person, it's just a photograph.
I can't.
There's no connection to your father, really.
I know, but it's actually from his face.
Think about the science, though.
And there's no potential harm at all in this situation.
You guys are you guys are horrible. You guys I'm actually quite emotional, and I don't even know. Well, I do know why, because you actually put it, it's kind of like it's like, when you're angry at someone and you rip up the picture, isn't it? It symbolises, this is the point, isn't it?
It is.
My dad travels a lot, and I just think if anything happened to him, I would never, it's just not worth it, and I could never ever forgive myself. I hate you all.
So I think that makes a couple of points. This way of thinking is sometimes very emotional, very automatic, very rapid. And although you can be very rational and try to kind of reason through things, sometimes the emotions just win out. And you actually have to sort of force yourself in some of these situations. Another thing is that people don't like to tempt fate, which means they're not exactly always sure about what's actually going on. So I like that example because it demonstrates that you can regard yourself as incredibly reasonable, secular, rational, and yet deep down you can still harbor beliefs which are effectively supernatural. Okay, what I'm going to end on, or the last actual thing I want to talk about, is essentialism. We obviously have some animal lovers. Now, essentialism has a very old origin. It was originally a Greek idea by the philosopher Plato. Now, Plato he didn't use the word essence, he talked about the word form. And what Plato believed was that there was a hidden dimension to reality which made things what they truly are. But we recognize this more commonly as the word of essence. This is the work of Susan Gelman. Now, Susan demonstrated that children spontaneously essentialize animals. And what that means is that they think there's something immutable. There's something inside an animal which makes it what it truly is. So even as young as 3, 4 years of age, children understand there's a dog has something inside it, which means it will always be a dog. And if you take a puppy and raise it with cats, it won't suddenly turn into a cat. So there's a doggy essence, and the doggy essence is different from the catty essence. And you can do kind of crazy experiments where you change it and make it look like a cat, but they'll know it's still a dog. So they know there's something in there. And there is a course, it's called DNA, but no preschooler, unless they go to a very good school, is ever taught about DNA. And before we even knew about DNA, we were reasoning that there's something inside living things which make them what they truly are. Now, interestingly, Richard Dawkins has said this is a dead hand of Plato, because he argues one of the problems that we have in understanding natural selection, for example, is that we look around and we see all the diversity of life on this planet, all the different animals, and we assume that they must be different, and they've always been different, rather than accepting the truth, which is that all life forms have a common ancestry. We know this from genetics. We know this as a theory of natural selection. But even if you understand natural selection, you might be able to accept that, for example, we share a common ancestry with chimpanzees, and that we have 98% of our DNA we're sharing with them, because we resemble them. But what's much harder to accept is that we share 50% of our DNA with a banana. So humans and bananas and monkeys all have a common ancestry. Admittedly, a long, long time ago, but we don't think like that because it seems to violate our essential way of seeing the world. So I've been interested in essences as this sort of hidden power, because I think we also essentialize things, objects that we think are really important to us emotionally. I would imagine there are many people in this room tonight who have wedding rings or matrimonial jewelry. And I bet if I was to offer you an identical duplicate, you wouldn't swap it. Even though you couldn't tell them apart, you wouldn't want to do that. And I could get you to think of a thought experiment where you imagine that a bit of the ring is replaced gradually over time to eventually none of the original material is in there. If that happens over a long enough period of time, you assume it's the same ring. It's still just been slightly modified, but it's still the same ring. But if you did that spontaneously and instantly, you regard it as different. So it's as if there's something over and beyond the physical composition of the ring, the material it's made of, which defines its true nature, its true identity. So I have been studying this in children because I think we also essentialize sentimental objects like teddy bears. So, all right, do we have anybody who has a teddy bear that they really like? Yeah? Yeah, very good. That's right. About 2 out of 3 children have these there. There's an adult there who's very happy to admit it. That's good. Actually, that's true, yeah. Many adults have it. It's a guilty secret that a lot of us have. And it's really interesting. It's a Western phenomenon, by the way. It's not as, there's not as many children in the Far East develop these strong emotional attachments to these teddy bears. And the reason is, we think, it's because of sleeping practices. You see, in the Far East, children will sleep, in traditional families, will sleep with the mother well into middle childhood. But in the West, what we do is we separate them around the first year, between 1 and 2 years of age. And I think what happens is that they get distressed, but babies self-soothe with whatever's in the crib, which typically is a teddy bear or a blanket. Now, what starts off as possibly a simple learned association, as we say, suddenly turns into something a little bit stranger, because these objects take on properties. The children start to think of them as if they're alive. They talk about them as if they have minds, that they get lonely. And of course, if you've ever lost one, and I know there might be some parents who will know that, it's almost like a family tragedy. Here's a wanted poster for a mouse, obviously lost in a park in Bristol sometime. And these things are irreplaceable. They're unique. You can't buy an identical mouse and give it to. If the child recognizes it's not the same mouse, then they'll reject it. And I've heard of stories of calls going out to radio stations and police stations to try and relocate these things. They are incredibly important. Now, we decided to investigate, could you ever convince a child to take an identical copy? So we recreated the duplication machine that you saw earlier on. It's a much smaller version of it this time, but we have these two scientific-looking boxes, and we showed the children what happens. We put an object in one of the boxes and close it up and then activate it, and we wore white coats so we looked like scientists. And then the second box would start up by itself, and then you opened up, and there's two identical objects. And the children believed it was like a photocopier for objects, or a 3D printer. It's probably more modern. So now that they understand what the machine can do, we asked them to bring along their attachment objects, whether it's a teddy bear or a blanket. And we also asked them to bring a favorite toy, one that they like to play with. We then placed the object in the machine and said, okay, and went through the process of duplicating. We said, which one would you like? Now, if it was just a favorite toy, they were quite happy to have the newly made one, because that was cool. By the way, this was all an illusion. This was all a magic trick. We really couldn't build a duplicating machine. If we could, I wouldn't be standing here. I'd be collecting a Nobel Prize. But we convinced them this machine worked. But if it was their attachment object, they either wouldn't let us put it into the machine, or they certainly wanted the original one back again. There was something which was irreplaceable, immutable, as we say. We couldn't give it, you couldn't exchange it. It turns out this attitude about authenticity, the original being important, we start to apply that to things which we consider valuable by their association with other people. So, for example, in another study, we told older children, these are 5- and 6-year-olds, we showed them a metal spoon or a metal cup, and we said this object is valuable because it's made of silver, and silver is a valuable metal, or it's valuable because it belongs to Queen Elizabeth II, and she's very famous. We then duplicated the objects, and we asked them how much is each worth. Now, if the original object was deemed to be valuable because it was made of silver, they felt the copy was worth the same as the original. But if the original was said to belong to Queen Elizabeth II, then the original was worth much more than the copy. And of course, that makes perfect sense to this. We value original works of art, and we think that anything else is simply a forgery. It doesn't have the unique qualities of the original. It's as if there's this essence which can't be duplicated. This attitude, of course, applies to other objects. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, there was a roaring trade to go and revere and worship objects which were deemed to have magical powers because of their connection with the saints at the time. In fact, these were actually literally often body parts of the saints. This is Doubting Thomas's finger, which is somewhere in a shrine in Italy. Well, reputedly, it's supposed to be Doubting Thomas's finger. But it doesn't have to be a religious saint. On the other side here, we have a piece of bed linen that Elvis Presley had slept upon. And somehow his essence had been transformed. There's a certificate of authenticity there. So we essentialize objects which we feel very strongly about emotionally. And of course, we also feel emotionally connected sometimes to locations. Some people who are devoutly religious feel a strong emotional connection to the Holy Land. You can go on eBay and you can buy dirt and water and oil from the Holy Land because they have this magical, supernatural component to it. And of course, we'll pay large amounts of money for, this is a glove by Michael Jackson. It's sold for $250,000. Now, it's as if, when people buy these celebrity things, they don't want them washed. It's as if somehow the essence of Michael Jackson is somehow in the glove. And people want to hold these things. It's as if there's some sort of positive contagion. But the flip side of this positive contagion is the darker side. Now, by the way, the talk is going to get a little bit sinister now. So if there's anyone of a nervous disposition or too young, don't look. It's going to get a little bit gruesome. The flip side of memorabilia is, of course, murderabilia. So here's a glove you probably wouldn't want to put on. I know that some of you will recognize this, but this is a famous glove from the murder scene of O.J. Simpson. And for many people, the notion of coming into physical contact with that makes them feel repulsed, makes them feel a bit sick. It's as if the evil of that murder has become somehow a physical thing that can rub off on you. Now, what could be more powerful than absorbing the essence of another person, literally by incorporating them? This is Armin Meiwes. Does anyone like cannibal stories? Put your hands up if you want to hear a cannibal story. Okay, the rest of you are not so sure. Okay, well, Armin Meiwes is a real-life cannibal. Yep, he was 2002 when they broke into his farmhouse outside Rottenburg. They found that he was eating the remains of this chap here. Now, what is very strange and weird and macabre is that these two individuals knew each other very well. They'd met on the internet on a chat room to discuss cannibalism. And I'm not going to tell you all the gory details. You can go and find out for yourself. But it's pretty unbelievable. But what makes this really unbelievable is that Armin Meiwes advertised for looking for somebody he wanted to eat. And he had 36 responses. People who wanted to be eaten. Because they had this perverse, weird idea that they wanted to live on inside the body of someone else. Now, when he was arrested, he was interviewed by the police. And he said, with every bite, every mouthful of him, my memory of him is getting stronger. My English is getting better. So he was believing that he was absorbing the essence of his victim. Now, you don't have to be a psychotic victim or murderer or killer. You can be someone who simply has an organ transplantation. This is much more friendly, Linda and Ian Gammons. Now, I've interviewed them a number of times and spoken to them. Now, Ian, back in 2006, had kidney failure. But luckily, his wife had a kidney which matched, and she donated her kidney to him. And, of course, he recovered and went on to, and is still very healthy and alive today. But what was interesting, 6 weeks after the operation, he felt that his personality was changing. He literally thought he was changing into his wife, adopting her attitudes and preferences. So again, it was as if you could absorb this identity. Now, again, this is a slightly macabre story. This idea that you can absorb the vitality, the identity of individuals is one of the more sinister sides of this essentialist thinking. In Africa, there's a real problem with HIV, but there is a belief that you can cure yourself if you have sex with a young virgin. And so there are terrible crimes going on where people are attacking children. Now, luckily, this is very rare. But what isn't rare is the trade in endangered animals. Another example of essentialist thinking. This is to satisfy the Far East Chinese traditional medicines, where the belief is that if you eat animals such as predators, and here we have bears and wolves and tigers, you can absorb their strength and their power. Or you can grind up rhino horn and use its magical potency to increase your vigor. So sacred things can be objects, people, places, anything which is revered. And they take on their supernatural properties and become special. So the talk up to now has been a bit dark, a bit macabre. And I'm going to end with something a little bit more fun. And I'm going to show you an example of an adult being reunited with her long-lost attachment object, which she thought she had lost. And I think this reveals very powerfully how our childhood emotions remain with us, even as adults.
I'm nervous.
That can be replaced, listen. Can be. Oh. I know what it is.
Yes.
I smelled him and I knew exactly who it was. Oh my God,
Okay. Right. I'm just going to end. I'm just going to end with this is one for the kids. Okay. This is for you guys. I want to leave you with the possibility that maybe there is some supernatural powers, and I might be the one with the supernatural power. Okay. I'm going to show you how I can control your mind. All right. I want you. Don't tell your neighbor. I want each of you children. I want you to choose a card. Choose one of these cards. And concentrate and think about it really hard, because I'm actually going to influence your minds. I'm going to make you choose the card because I can make it disappear. And it's gone. Thank you very much.
Bruce will be happy to answer some questions. I'll bring the lights up a little bit, and go ahead and choose who you want. And we ask that you come line up right here to ask your questions. If you have a question, come line up right here. If you have to leave, please be as quiet as possible. We'd appreciate your attention now so we can hear what the questions are.
Sorry? I lose a few of the youngsters there, but it was all right.
What happens to make people believe in ESP?
Hello, sorry. Say it one more time.
What happens to make people believe in ESP?
ESP. Now, ESP is interesting. ESP is this ability, extrasensory perception. And extrasensory perception sounds very scientific, doesn't it? It sounds like it's just, you know, our minds. We think we don't use all of our brain capacity, and lots of science fiction tells us that if we, you know, we can increase our brain power and develop telekinesis and psychic powers. But the truth of the matter is that we've really looked very hard for the evidence to support ESP, and unfortunately we haven't found anything to support it. It's just one of these beliefs. We call it paranormal, but it's not paranormal. It's not like a paralegal or paramedic, some sort of type of extension of normality. It really is a supernatural belief, because if it's true, then it violates the natural laws as we currently understand them. But I will just say one thing. The way that brain science is advancing and our capacity to use new technologies, we may actually be able to harness the power of our brain to do things which seem to be, at the moment, magical, because that's simply we haven't built the technologies to do so.
Okay.
You're very welcome.
So I heard what you said about if you eat an animal, you get their personalities. If you eat steak, do you get personalities of a cow?
Well, so the question was, if you eat steak, do you take on the personality of the cow? Well, no, not exactly.
Good.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well done.
Who are more suspicious, grown-ups or kids?
Oh, that's a great question. Who are more suspicious, grown up or kids? Well, actually, adults can be even more suspicious or superstitious, because we've got research showing that, and Christine Lagarde, who invited me, has demonstrated that quite often some beliefs get stronger as you get older. And that's because beliefs are very useful to signify to other people in our group that we're just like them. So sometimes having beliefs is very powerful to show to other people that you are just like them.
You mean kids are more suspicious?
No, I'm saying superstitions are naturally emerging quite often, but sometimes they can get even stronger in adults. I'll tell you what really makes people superstitious. Economic uncertainty.
Oh.
When economies are going badly, people become very superstitious. So all this way of trying to control the world, the unpredictable nature, is related to how wealthy you are.
Okay.
Great segue for me, actually. 2 questions. 1, have you ever worked with Darren Brown? And 2, to what extent do you think political beliefs are superstitious?
Oh, wow. Well, Darren Brown is a British mentalist. He's an amazing stage magician. And what's good about Darren Brown is he doesn't pretend he has any supernatural powers. He's very open about it. And he's a great advocate of explaining how psychology can demonstrate some incredible things about the human mind, our tendency to believe things. So he uses that for his stage magic. I haven't worked with him personally, but he is from Bristol, so that's that's the link I assume you were making. Political systems and religion. That's a complex one, isn't it? Typically, I'm always worried about talking about that in this country for obvious reasons, and this far south. But maybe, sorry, I believe that Austin is slightly different from the rest, but I'm not sure. There are studies looking at the relationships between those sorts of things, and in general, people who are more liberal tend to be less likely to be the sort of, devoutly superstitious.
Thanks.
I first want to say thank you so much for coming to talk to us. Your lecture was very fascinating.
Thank you.
I was kind of curious because there's so many options in the world what you can study. So how did you first become interested in psychology?
Well, I was a believer. I'm old enough to remember Uri Geller. Well, he's still around, isn't he? Yeah, he's still around. He's not moved on to another world. No, Uri Geller, he was an amazing tour de force. When he appeared on our television screens, he was making things, unbelievable things happen, spoons bend. So when I was young, I wanted to go to university to, like that young chap asked, I wanted to study ESP. I wanted to kind of see what the human brain was capable of. And I looked at the evidence, and it soon became clear that science had really studied it very thoroughly, and there was no evidence for it. And then I got really fascinated with the mind because, you know, the science of belief is really an interesting field about what makes people want to believe, and why does this help us as groups and as a social animal, and how does our tendency to believe what we're told influence us? So I think this whole field is really rich with a combination of our understanding of what it is to be a social animal, with some of the brain sciences about what makes the difference between a believer and a non-believer, and the roles of development and how our families can influence. These are all relevant things. So I started off believing in this, or wanting to believe in it. By the way, I would love to have supernatural powers. I think we all would. But, you know, unfortunately, not this realm. Thanks very much.
Hi. Essentialism seems to be a big part of something built into language. We have dictionaries full of very concrete definitions for words. Is there any difference between different languages and the essentialist beliefs that are associated with words, or is there some way to test the relationship between essentialist beliefs and how the language is constructed?
That's a fascinating question, and I actually haven't got a good answer for that at the moment. I mean, essentialism, I think, I am fascinated with essentialism because I think it explains many aspects of our attitudes. For example, things which we find repugnant are often violations of essentialism. Anything which threatens the integrity of what it is to be a human, anything which is biological, genetic modification, these are violations of essentialism. But in relation to language, because language is a symbolic system, isn't it? It's using sounds to stand for in reference to things. I honestly don't know whether or not there's a difference between essentialism in different languages. But it's a fascinating question, and if you're a linguist, you know, there's something to look at.
Well, hello there. Thank you very much for this fascinating speech. So here was my question. We talked a lot about how belief in supernatural and superstition is sort of a natural thing for humans. How and why do people unlearn this supernatural belief? Or, like, what's the best way to help people unlearn it? And should they unlearn it? That's what I thought of while listening to this.
That's three great questions. Well, first of all, I don't think they ever go away. I think these are always with us. You can suppress them. But if the context is right and the conditions are risky, and you know, people suddenly, as I say, there are no atheists at 30,000 feet when the plane hits turbulence. You know, you're kind of praying it's going to land fine. So I think you can operate with different modes. But what makes the difference between a believer and a non-believer? That's a fascinating question. I think what we're doing very often is suppressing the tendency to default to this very quick and rapid way of seeing the world. But the simple answer is science education. That's the biggest predictor of religiosity, for example. But again, as I said, even people who are highly educated nevertheless still harbor, I think, these notions, these earlier intuitive ways of seeing the world. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to let you know about a funny superstition here at UT before I step off the stage. Have you heard about the albino squirrel?
No.
I think, yeah. The albino squirrel.
There's an albino.
I think that this would be a good one for your next book. So here on UT campus, we have this tradition about the so-called albino squirrel. It's actually like a light-colored blonde squirrel. It's really pretty, sort of champagne color.
Right.
And a lot of students here believe that if you see the albino squirrel on the day you take an exam, no matter what you do, you will get an A on that exam. So there's another.
All right.
So I think that for the student, that's kind of like the atheist at 30,000 feet. Even I've gotten pretty excited about seeing the albino squirrel.
Okay, but the squirrel does exist, or?
It does. I've seen it. I've even fed chocolate to it, so I should be getting like honors and everything. All right, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Hi.
Hey, thanks for coming to speak with us. We talk about all these interesting things and phenomena and experiments that you can run and share about, and we all agree there's really interesting things that happen that underpin our mind, our psychological processes, our evolutionary lineage and story. do we think we're anywhere close to moving forward or finding more scientific understanding? Maybe that's connected, who knows, to heavy-duty physics like quantum theory. Are we closer to sort of seeing that this other domain, that there's discoveries lie ahead there in the way that, like, Newton discovered that gravity? Are we anywhere close to that kind of discovery where mind-body is so much more than just a hobby?
Yeah, well, there's a number of points you've raised there. I would just like to point out that whenever I give this talk, usually someone asks me a quantum question, because all the sorts of laws, when I say the natural laws, that what I'm referring to is the Newtonian world that we exist in. But of course, you get down to the very teeny-weeny, those laws all fall apart, or the very, very large with black holes and that. So there's always the scope or the possibility that the explanations that, I mean, it's fantastical. The more you learn about quantum, the more you realize that what we don't know. I don't think we're ever really going to necessarily be able to tap into that at that level. I mean, to me, the understanding of quantum defies, in many ways, you know, my mind. A lot of the arguments, a lot of the evidence is based by mathematical deductions. So it's not in our nature as non-specialists to understand the sort of explanations at those levels of the universe. Whether we could tap into it, I'm not sure. I don't necessarily think that's going to help us. Of course, people are trying to use quantum stories to make sense of something like consciousness. But as my understanding is that most people who evoke those sorts of explanations don't actually understand what they're talking about.
Sure. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi. So you mentioned Uri Geller on the television, and that's a little bit before my time, but that got me wondering. Do you think that the internet and kind of the information superstructures that we have now have impacted superstition on a cultural level in some way now that we have you know, access to popular science and different worldviews?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually. I mean, there's enough crazies in the world that you'll always find you know, enough groupings. So you know, there's been a spread of a degree of secular thinking. We've seen the growth in certain movements, and I think that's been facilitated by the internet. But we've also seen some extremism positions, and that's simply because the internet allows these individuals to communicate. And for example, conspiracy theories are, you know, one of the best things. They seem to be burgeoning because of the internet. It allows people to kind of search for evidence. By the way, I should point out, science, the nature of science is to try and be critical. Scientists are professional skeptics. We make a living by criticizing each other's experiments and trying to do them better. Believers, in contrast, are not trying to disprove. They're just trying to find evidence to support the belief. So they're not. They've got almost a different agenda. So I suppose the internet allows believers to find the evidence that supports their particular position. So rather than making it more democratic and flattening out this sort of radical notions, I think actually the internet allows people to become even, you know, crazier, as it were.
Thank you.
Gosh, how old are you?
58. Oh. So the end of the line will be the last question now? Not now, but when we get to you. Okay. So no one get online.
Why would another person want to eat a person?
Why would another? Very good question. Why would I? Well, unfortunately, there are some very disturbed people in the world who have very strange beliefs. And luckily, that sort of thing is very rare. Now, there was a time when it wasn't so rare. There used to be tribes where it was done, but often they did it to absorb the power of their enemies, and that was the belief that you could take on their vigor of their victims. But that is so rare today. I mean, it hardly happens. And in the cases it does happen, it's because people they have mental illnesses usually. Well, hopefully.
Okay.
Thanks.
Why do people believe in, why do people make scary stuff to scare other people?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think we like to be scared. I think we're fascinated by these stories. We enjoy them in the safety of the comfort of a safe environment. People like horror movies. Why do we like horror movies and things like that? Well, I think it's a bit like being on a roller coaster ride. You know, it's kind of safe, but the thrill of it is a little bit exciting.
Yeah.
So I think that we like to be, you know, we like the thrill and the excitement these things do. So that's what I think is going on. Thank you.
I have a two-part question that's kind of interrelated. The first one is, how do you avoid, or how does one avoid a skepticism trap where you're so skeptical of anything you don't allow for anything that's outside of your experience and then fall into the same trap you're doing? And the second part, more important but a little bit less serious, how quickly do you ignore everything you know when your sports team is losing?
That's a good point. Yeah. Well, you're right. There is a danger. I mean, there is a danger of dogma, and there is dogma in science. We do know that's true, but science, if it's done properly, should be self-correcting. I think, to be honest, we know that there are biases operating there as well. But over the span of time, eventually, it should, that problem should be eradicated. So, yeah, I hands up. We're kind of guilty of that as well. So overt, complete skepticism, unwillingness to be open to the possibility is something which should be avoided. And of course, I think that's also one of the reasons that people get upset by very militant statements by certain individuals who will remain nameless, who basically are telling people they're stupid. And you're never going to convince somebody out of their belief systems by saying you're an idiot. That doesn't work, as we've discovered. It's much better to try and see the world from their perspective and develop a rapport or conversation which enables you to sort of think about, why they might be thinking that. So our field, I think, is more productive by looking at these ways of seeing the world and trying to understand why they emerged and what benefits and why they still persist. That's, I think, a much more productive way of investigating it rather than sort of dismissing it.
And your sports team?
Oh, I'm not a sports fan, but I do have my rituals. I think we all do. We like certainty, and we have habits. I tend to have a pre-ritual of eating a banana before I come on, and I still do it. And they had to get me bananas for tonight's lecture, so there you go. And I meant to use the banana for the banana gag at the DNA, but anyway, there you go.
Hi. So I want to ask, when we were talking about mind-body dualism,
yeah,
you mentioned a very particular thing about the possibility of us just being complex machines, complex enough that we could build a machine that could do the same things.
Able to, yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that, for example, here, the researchers in our computer science department will definitely be very excited talking about. So my first question is, to what extent do you see this being a multidisciplinary field of research and such that researchers from different areas could get together and discuss these kinds of things and actually provide to the research? And my second question would be, to what extent do these beliefs feed into a self-confirming bias? Like how would a self-confirmation bias be related to this and strengthening, say?
Okay, so I'll take the second one first. Mm-hmm. Is that a general question about how confirmation biases support any belief systems, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, basically, we don't like to be wrong. We avoid being wrong, and we only pay attention to evidence which supports our initial position. So confirmation bias is just one of the mechanisms. I didn't have time to talk about that. Would be just one of the mechanisms which make us sort of seek out things which support our position. The first question about multidisciplinarity and building AI. Did you know that Marvin Minsky, one of the 4 founders of AI in this country, is at MIT? The story goes, apparently in 1967, he made it an undergraduate summer project to build a computer that can see. That was done 60 years ago, and we still can't do it. And what I think that reveals is what we misunderstood to be what is complexity. We were building the original machines for artificial intelligence, so we're trying to build it from a kind of what we call a top-down way of doing it. And what we're now understanding, actually, we got better insight by looking at developmental psychology about how children naturally start to learn about the world. And now you see learning algorithms which are trying to replicate the sorts of intuitions or replicate the same sort of learning processes that happen naturally as humans. So that's a good example where understanding of psychology has helped the engineers develop the systems. And so I just see a continued cross-fertilization between that. I think we're learning about engineering. I think our psychology is going to be changing in a sense that technologies, for example, social networking, this is an exciting time. I think there's going to be some major transitions in the way that we interact because of our technology. So, yeah, there's always going to be a degree of cross-fertilization.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It was really great.
Thank you.
But earlier you touched on something I've been interested in for a while. You said that humans are something along the lines of naturally curious, and we seek out answers even if they don't necessarily make sense in a scientific way.
Yeah.
So why do you think we're like that? Why we just
Why do we need help?
Yeah, we're so prone to
Right.
filling in gaps and things like that.
Yes. So one of the things that we don't like is unpredictable worlds and risky worlds. And it's very stressful not to know what's going to happen next. So in the absence of that, what we do is we invent rituals or strategies or behaviors to create what's called an illusion of control. Because if we feel that doing something can make an influence, that actually is quite beneficial to us. So take, for example, superstitions in sport. You know, if sport, there are many highly, it's one of the areas which are very superstitious and gambling is the other one for obvious reasons. By doing something, we're trying to control the circumstances which have been successful in the past. We look for patterns, okay? And so we, for example, one day we wear maybe odd socks and we win a match. We think, well, maybe it was related to the odd socks, and we start to wear odd socks. That perception or illusion and control can actually be a self-fulfilling prophecy because it gives us the expectation that we can influence outcomes. To the extent that if you stop them or thwart them in doing their superstitions, they don't necessarily perform up to standard because they feel they're no longer sort of protected. So I think it's in our nature to try and understand the world around us to predict it. That's the other reason we have brains, by the way. There are many living things on this planet which don't have brains. We evolved brains to process the world, to try and understand it, to build up a knowledge base in order to predict what's going to happen next. That's why you have a brain, is to predict the environment. So in doing so, that's why we generate explanatory theories rather than letting things go.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Very good.
Thank you all for coming. See you again on May 1st.